We all just need to breathe. This is the 2024 election cycle. As many of you, I have also been watching the DNC and watching the sort of changes that have happened in this political climate, and have a sense of dread, but also a sense of sort of clarity looking back since 2016 to now about the kinds of political cycles that this country undergoes, the kind of politics that get espoused in the media, the kind of coronation of certain individuals of the ruling class to come and represent and seek votes in this country. But I also want to just take a moment and kind of step back from all of that to think about what does it mean to be a human being in this particular moment in time. That's not something that our political class is asking of us. That's not something our media class is asking of us. But I think as people who are on the left and thinking about creating a better planet and a future for all of us, this is something that we have to do, and we have to breathe. We have to stop and breathe and take this particular political moment for what it is. And I want to start by looking at what happened at the DNC. When I talk to my students, when I talk to my comrades in organizing spaces, when I give public lectures or I'm in study groups, I always caution against following the presidential election cycles in the United States. And the reason why I do this is because these sort of politics tend to suck out all of the oxygen in the room, and everything that we had been working on, whether it's long-term projects, short-term sort of, protests or movements, get sort of sucked up into this political cycle that, frankly, we don't have control over. We don't have control over the outcomes, and we don't have control over the narrative. That doesn't mean you shouldn't follow it, but you don't beat yourself up trying to follow every single thing that comes out of, the corporate media about what Trump said and, what Kamala Harris said or what President Biden has said, because it's a losing battle. The sort of coronation of the next ruling class. And, as an objective observer, we should look back and think, these are the candidates for the bourgeoisie that the ruling class has put forward as their best representatives. You have Trump, a multiple convicted white collar criminal, to say nothing of his, sort of overt, sort of fascistic, right-wing racist sort of character. And then you have Kamala Harris, who was somebody that nobody wanted back in 2020 in terms of even Democratic donors, sort of resigned in disgrace before she could say and do things that were, damaging to her political career. She was essentially selected by, an elder statesman such as President, Biden. And there wasn't a democratic process. And this is me not I'm not here to redeem the Democratic Party. I'm just here to look at what has happened, right? But nonetheless, she was selected by Biden as his next successor, right? Kind of circumventing the whole democratic, quote unquote, small d democratic process that was supposed to happen. And we saw this happen in 2016, with the taking of the candidacy, or even allowing sort of a debate at the DNC around the selection of a populist candidate like Bernie Sanders, who has totally revealed himself in this moment as an apologist for Israeli sort of settler colonialism and Zionism, but nonetheless he kind of represented this upsurge in 2016, as well as a little bit in 2020, as an alternative within the sort of ruling Democratic Party. And I'm bringing all of this up because I think these years are important, because 2016, was the year that the Standing Rock movement happened, the movement of water protectors. Obviously, water protectors, that wasn't a term that was just invented in 2016. They've been around since there's been, since time immemorial, but nonetheless, we're in the age of the water protector And that's something I'm talking about in my new book, or the republication of my old book from 2019 called Our History is the Future. But the publication of that book has made me rethink some of these, key, 4-year cycles that are happening in US politics, and sort of the failure of a alternative to emerge. And I'm not blaming necessarily the social movements, but looking at the larger structures at play, at how these movements get co-opted within specifically the Democratic Party. That also goes into what has happened in 2020 in terms of the George Floyd uprisings that that literally lit aflame major U.S. cities across the United States, Canada, North America, and in some cases the world. But that, you had the language of defund the police and a really critical look at law enforcement. But the momentum for that particular movement seemed to have been absorbed and captured by Democratic operatives and politicians to move that momentum into, oh, well, this happened under Trump, so we have to get Biden in, because otherwise we're going to have 4 more years of Trump. And that means we're going to have increased police violence and repression. But you have to remember that Biden said in that election cycle, if you elect me, there will be, nothing will fundamentally change. And I think that's an important thing. It's like you always have to believe, people when they say something about who they are and what they're going to do. And I think this has been the sort of character or defining feature of Biden's presidency. There's a lot to say about Biden the person, but nonetheless, his sort of policy hasn't changed. It hasn't deviated in many ways, even from what Trump put into place, or let alone what Obama before him had put in place. So now we are entering, the 2024 election cycle. Elections happen in November, but there is a sort of sense that the Palestine solidarity movement, as it has erupted across, major cities, and nearly every city in this country, and college campuses, would kind of meet a similar fate. And in some ways it has, and in other ways it hasn't. And it's partially because of the recalcitrant sort of racist nature of this settler colony called the United States, which I'll get into in a little bit. But it also, has to do with attempting to blunt the sort of sharp edge of this criticism. And I think it's not just criticism, but of this movement. And this movement really strikes to the core of what the United States is. And I think that is why something like the DNC expose the contradictions, but also the sort of oppressive nature of the Democratic Party and what it has done when it does take power. And I think I'm offering this sort of monologue, something I don't do on this channel. I kind of leave that up to my comrades, Melanie and Elena at Red Power Hour, to kind of look at the moment. So I wanted to kind of take this moment because a lot of people have been asking me personally, but also asking our organization, Red Nation, where do we stand on elections? Where do we, how do we kind of like view this current political moment? So I'm going to offer up some observations and thinking through what it means to be somebody on the left during this time, but also where our sort of indigenous movements are at. And I think the best place to start is the DNC. Not because it offers any kind of modicum of alternative, but because this constant fear-mongering around, well, if you don't vote Democrat, you could get Trump. And if there's ever a cynical politics in this particular moment in time, that's it, because there is no alternative. I mean, we go back to the era of neoliberalism, and we think of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who promoted this idea that there cannot be an alternative to capitalism. We go through this era of like Fukuyama announcing the end of history and the sort of rise and the dominance of liberal capitalism. Then we go into this really bloody 2 decades of endless war making by both, Republican and Democratic presidencies and administrations, to the point where some of these wars have almost been completely like memory hold. Like we talk about the invasion of Iraq, and we talk about the sort of mass death toll that had. And I remember, when I was first politicized back in 2003, I mean, I was reading a lot of political literature. I was reading, things that I felt like were speaking to me as a young person in this country. And it wasn't until, I remember watching 9/11 happen on television, the Twin Towers, getting hit by those two airplanes, and then, the targeting of the Pentagon, and just feeling an immense amount of fear, and not knowing what was going to come next. And I do think that the entire country was basically fear-mongered into accepting this kind of assault on this particular region, right? And I remember reading at that time, and I can't remember if it was before or after 9/11, but nonetheless, I read The Fateful Triangle by Noam Chomsky, and I began to think about, this question of Palestine and U.S. foreign policy. And for me, the invasion of Iraq, it kind of resonated, and invasion of Afghanistan too. It kind of resonated with how the U.S. war on terror was kind of framing, terror, quote unquote terrorists, these kind of nameless, faceless kind of entities or combatants who were stateless, and they didn't have any rights, etc. And it was really hearkening back, and both the language but also the legal definitions and justifications for the U.S. war on terror is hearkening back to the Indian Wars in the United States. And I'll give you two examples. One, is the example of Osama bin Laden. His code name was Geronimo, right? Geronimo was a resistance fighter, an Apache resistance fighter, really reviled by the U.S. military for his ability to escape and to lead sort of guerrilla warfare against not only the U.S. military, which was unable to capture him. He ended up surrendering, but then also, settler society as a whole. He was kind of this figure, this ghost-like figure whose name could be invoked to sort of scare, everyday settlers on the frontier who were invading his territory, right? And he is seen as a sort of positive figure by many in Native America or in Native communities. There's varying perspectives on him. I don't want to just say that we're all sort of unified around that, but nonetheless he's kind of brought up as a figure of indigenous resistance. Well, that was also the name of Osama bin Laden, right? So those sort of parallels with the Indian Wars, where it's like the United States is recycling basically the endless wars that it waged on Native people, and using it culturally to essentially say, well, these are the new Indians, right? Anything that can be made Indian is thus a target of U.S. empire. And then the other one is, looking at the John C. Yu torture memos. This was a man, he was legal counsel for the Bush administration at the time, but he was the one who drafted the legal justification for the use of torture in places like Guantanamo Bay, but also across the world. And his legal rationale for the United States use of torture harkened back to the Modoc Wars, which essentially said that Modoc people who were resisting, U.S. incursion and invasion in their territories were non-state actors, and therefore they weren't subject to sort of rights within the system. So you could basically do anything you want to them. And so this is the era of, endless war making. And then we talk about those bloody wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But one thing that's also not talked about in this moment is the U.S. intervention in Syria and the bloody sort of wars and mass displacement that happens. This sort of platforming of so-called Syrian freedom fighters, and the attempt to destabilize Syria. And I remember at that time I was wondering, in my mind, I was like, why Syria? Why why would the United States push itself into another sort of country in this region? And obviously the larger question is oh, well, there's always been a military outpost in the region, which is a state called Israel, a Zionist European settler colonial project. And this is a term that's contested. This is a term that could probably get you fired now today on campuses, and I want to talk about that too. But I'm kind of prefacing what happened at the DNC, because this question sort of looms large, right? And I remember, when some of my friends, some very good people, asked me, what do I think about the uncommitted movement? And I was like, well, I'm not a Democrat, so I can't really comment on this. And they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, shouldn't we be pushing for some kind of, concessions from the Democratic Party? And I said, well, I'm not interested because I'm not a Democrat. This is a Democratic party. These are Democrats within the party who are trying to shift, the opinion of their genocide policy. And it's like, I think that's kind of a losing battle. That's just my personal opinion. And so people kind of just wrote me off, which is fine. I'm happy to have political disagreements, but I followed the uncommitted movement for a while. And, it's like, I do think that the opposition is important. I do think that there are a lot of people in the United States who only see, the alternative within these two parties. But I think in some ways it's a losing battle. And we saw that play out at the DNC.
Council Vice Chair Zach Pamami and Secretary Lori Melchior.
Here we are together on our ancestral homelands of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation and our sister Potawatomi nations. We also honor the spirit of the other tribal nations who traveled westward to this beautiful area. Welcome, 2024 Democratic National Convention, to our homelands. This land has and always will carry enormous importance to its original stewards, our ancestors, and our present-day communities. I am Vice Chairman of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, joined by Secretary Lori Melchior, and our nation's Tribal Council, who are also with us in the audience. From time immemorial, our ancestors lived in the Great Lakes region. However, in 1849, an illegal auction by the U.S. government forcibly removed our tribe from our homeland. Since then, we have been working to reclaim it. Finally, this year, the Department of the Interior placed some of our ancestral lands west of Chicago into a trust. Thanks to the resolve of our tribal community and the Biden-Harris administration, we reclaimed a piece of our home. We became the only federally recognized tribal nation in Illinois in 175 years. Together in our homelands, let's have a joyful, historic convention. Blessings to you all. Miigwech.
The DNC opens with a land acknowledgement. It takes place in a place called Chicago, which was a really kind of important, frontier outpost and trade. There's also been a vibrant history of Indigenous resistance here. There's been some kind of movement around land return here as well to Indigenous people, especially to Potawatomi people who were genocided and removed. All important history to talk about. But it's fascinating that it's acknowledging, it's acknowledging it implicitly, maybe not explicitly, genocide and removal as a sort of prevailing policies towards Native people of this land, and if not Indigenous people in general. And you have this acknowledgement, right? Which is kind of like, if you work in a university system or if you're part of a nonprofit, maybe they even do this at unions. I've seen it done, in other places or libraries. They do a land acknowledgement. And this is kind of like a hot topic for a lot of Native people for a variety of reasons. But I think it's always fascinating to do a land acknowledgement in relative comfort, knowing that just sort of invoking either prior Indigenous presence on the land or prior occupation on the land somehow, absolves one of having to deal with the present realities of Native people or the assertions of sovereignty, presence, and governance and belonging to place and authority and jurisdiction. Native people aren't just a culture. Like, Native societies had and continue to have our own set of laws, our own set of rules about belonging, membership, and relations to territory. But this sort of gets collapsed within this kind of like, liberal feel-good land acknowledgement. And the worst part about it, I think, or the most nefarious part about it, is acknowledging sort of indigenous presence, prior presence in this very hyper genocidal and eliminationist settler colony, while completely ignoring the policies of your own party towards indigenous people in Palestine. And this is something that, like, we get a lot of pushback on, not just we as the Red Nation, but I think in general, to say the word indigenous as if this is sort of some sort of sacrosanct category, and it's not. It's just an identity. I would prefer not to be indigenous, and people will be like, well, why would you not want to be indigenous? And this is something I've talked to one of my friends and friend of the show, Kim Tallbear, is that indigenous is an empty signifier. It doesn't really mean anything other than its relationship to a colonizing force or a colonizing entity like the United States. We became indigenous because the United States colonized our land. Had it not done so, I would just be a Lakota person. That's it. Actually, to aspire for a sort of sense of self-determination around our own sort of political, cultural, social, and economic development seems radical, because it's like, when you say I don't want to be indigenous anymore, people think that you are assimilating into a system. It's like, no, actually, we're asserting our own sovereignty, our own rules, and our own laws, and our own understandings of history and presence in this land. And that's why we were targeted for elimination to begin with. That's why people hate a Palestinian flag, right? It's because a Palestinian, who's waving a flag or a keffiyeh saying, I'm not a hyphenated subject. I'm from a nation of people who's in struggle, who's trying to articulate itself. I'm from a people, right? That's why you can't have Palestinians, whatever hyphenated, identity they want to be, Palestinian American, Palestinian Canadian, whatever it is. They don't want the assertion of presence of Palestinians within the DNC platform. And this isn't something hyperbolic. This is an action that the DNC took to not include even the people, even the Palestinians within, the Palestinians, and the activists within their own ranks who were pro, or for like an arms embargo, or for Palestinian rights. They would rather platform people who, are the children of contras who tortured, maimed, killed, raped, and destroyed, communities within and people within nations like Nicaragua, right? Or they would rather have, people who are anti, they're anti-gay, they're they're racist. Some of the most like vile, not just like members of the Democratic Party, but Republicans. They would rather platform a Republican than put a Palestinian within their own ranks on the stage with them. That's how, like, racist, there's no other way to put it. That's how racist the DNC is. But yet it is going out and trying to farm and trying to pressure and trying to, coerce these communities to vote for them, to say that Kamala Harris's policy, towards Palestine is going to be better. It may not be the best. It'll be a policy of genocide nonetheless, because if she's continuing what Biden has done on Palestine, then her policy is a policy of genocide. But it's going to be better than, or less, I guess, genocidal. I don't know if we're arguing for like degrees of like what kind of spectrum of genocide are we talking about than what Donald Trump would propose. And to me, that is a very, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, right? You don't have to be somebody who is a political junkie who's watching, all the sort of, the ticker and seeing like every political development to know that your party does not, care about Palestinians. And in fact, it promotes and will continue to arm the largest purveyor of violence against Palestinians. That is not a choice, right? And you don't even need to be Palestinian to sympathize or to understand that kind of position. And so when I watched the DNC, I watched it all in retrospect, and I picked and choose. There's no way I'm going to sit and watch this all night long. Like, don't do that to yourself, guys. Please, please don't do that to yourself. Have first of all, have some dignity and respect for yourself. But also don't let, your sort of perceptions of the DNC get filtered through, whatever political commentator. You should watch this stuff. I mean, you should watch, Kamala Harris, give her speech and, talk about making the U.S. military the most lethal military, and fighting force in the country or in the world. And, that should scare you, because none of her, the rest of her speech was not talking about, the kind of crisis that we're actually facing as, as people that live in this country, but throughout the world. It's like your priority is to rebuild and to re-strengthen and to, expand U.S. military imperialism. The more than 800 overseas military bases that literally encompass the globe, like that's a priority to you, when the average life expectancy of a everyday person who lives in this country has declined, as medical debt piles up, as mortgage rates and interest rates and housing costs all pile up, as inflation has literally gouged the lowest sectors of the society, lowest income sectors of the society. And that's to say nothing of the condition that Native people find themselves in today. The life expectancy has dropped, and it's I think it's like 5.9 that they found with these recent epidemiological studies that are coming out, and many of them attributed this to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're finding out more research, and this is something I've been following for a while, that this drastic drop in life expectancy is it's not really related to COVID-19. It's other factors, other social economic factors. To give you an example, the state that I was born and raised in, South Dakota, the median age, of a Native person there is, or life expectancy, I should say. The median age of life expectancy in South Dakota is 57 years old. 57 years old. And that's important to think about because, our population in South Dakota, we're one of the youngest population demographics in the country. And imagine this life expectancy, this median age, this is something that is you find in other parts of the world, and you hear sort of these, you hear these sort of the moralizing of the United States, the United Nations against these countries for the way that their, quote unquote, regimes oppress them and kill them and don't grant them the same access to life as they deserve as the rest of the planet. And I would say, that's something we should all be striving for, is to create dignity and increase the life chances of everyone. But why is that not the priority in the United States? We don't see this, in the headlines of mainstream media. And in fact, it's something that we don't even talk about. And when we think about, okay, well, they gave us a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this thing. We have representation, Vice Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's Ojibwe, she spoke at the DNC. There was an individual from South Dakota who was, announced during the roll call, the Ochete Shakoi. Shouldn't that be we got representation, we got a seat at the table, right? Shouldn't that translate into the material sort of change in our shift in our livelihoods? And the sad reality is it hasn't. It shows the limits, even within, if we're just selfishly looking at, Native quality of life in this country. It's actually decreased. And I'm not saying it's it's the Biden administration's fault or it's the Trump administration's fault. These epidemiological studies have shown that this actually was a trend that was happening, prior to even Trump. It was something that was happening probably that has its origins in the Obama administration. This sharp, steady decline in life expectancy for Native people in this country. So that, to me, I'm just bringing this up as an example of one of many things that we should be concerned about. We're not seeing Kamala Harris say, hey, we need to actually, make life livable for the people who are actually in this country. We're actually, this is, there's lots of intellectual arguments you can make about this. I'm just saying like basic facts. I'm just trying to be a little polemical here to say, well, we can't increase the life expectancy of Native people in this country, let alone, the average, the average, whatever that means, American in this country. But our priority and what's going to get us the votes is if we promise to make the U.S. military the most lethal military in the world. Like, how is that a politics, that you want to subscribe to? How is that like winning votes? And I can't imagine, that it really is within their political calculus to win those votes, because the sad reality is that almost half of this, the voting population, voting age, or eligible voters in the United States simply don't vote. And for a variety of reasons, you don't get time off, like they want to chastise the country of, Venezuela for, stealing the election so that, Nicolas Maduro, becomes the dictator again. Well, they actually vote for, they use a popular vote, meaning that every vote counts in that country towards the presidential election. We don't have a popular vote. We don't even, when we vote at a polling station, we're not like, yeah, they're tallying it on CNN, they're tallying it on Fox News, every vote that happens, but it's the electoral college that makes the final decision. And we don't read those numbers for, sometimes, weeks, months after, like we don't understand the final vote tallies. So I don't think they really care that people don't vote, that there isn't a large turnout. And in fact, like, Trump lost to Hillary Clinton when you think about the popular vote. Like more people, I would say, were against, a Trump presidency in this country than there were people who were for it. That includes the people who didn't vote for him and those who voted against him. So we're living in this moment where it's like they're threatening, like the media class is saying, if you don't vote for Harris, a creeping fascism is on the horizon. And we lived 4 years under that, under Trump, and we saw what he was capable of doing. And I'm sitting there, like many of people of conscience, like saying, well, that's not really the case. I mean, the authoritarianism, well, we don't even have direct democracy in this country. It's not even something that's like valued in this country. And in fact, if you try to run a third party in this country, you'll have an opposition. There are some really, interesting candidates that are from third parties that I think everyone should, focus on, but they're not given the same airtime because they don't have the same connections. The CNN or MSNBC is not working with, these third parties to put them on the debate stage with people like, Trump and Kamala Harris, because they're channeling all this into, these two parties, which are both, representatives, different sort of factions of the ruling class. Where these other parties, some of them might be parts of the ruling class, but some of them, aren't. Some of them are opposed to that. Some of them represent sort of the bottom rungs of society, not the bottom rungs of society, but like everyday people, whether they're individual candidates like Cornel West or, people who run, like through the Green Party, like Jill Stein, or others who are with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, like Claudia de la Cruz. They represent sort of factions, against this corporate and capitalist monopoly not only within the economic system but also within the political system. But we don't hear those options, right? So, this is something that I kind of wanted to just like talk about a little bit and kind of think through, because it's like, well, okay, so that's great. Like you told us all the problems, Nick. So like, where do we go from here? We think of like the reaction to Palestine, and it should be an indicator like, okay, so we're afraid to vote for Trump because he represents we're afraid to, not vote because if we don't vote against Trump, he's going to institute a sort of fascistic order like we've never seen before. To use his language, he's always like, oh, never seen this before, never seen before. And the reality is that Palestine kind of represents this critical dialectic, or exposes the critical dialectic of foreign and domestic policy. And we're seeing that now. I work at the University of Minnesota, And most of the sort of questions around, campus protest movements, the rules have solely focused on the pro-Palestine movement, the student encampments, and to the point where the Board of Regents is now moving to restrict the ability of students to organize and protest on campus, which I think represents a whole lot of questions. For me, it's like, well, what about unions? Like, what about people who are the unions on campus that want to picket? Or is that now like banned? But this attempt to sort of create safety on campus to protect the really loud minoritarian views of people who are frankly pro-genocide, because if you're not anti-genocide, then in this moment you're pro-genocide. People want to say there's nuances to that. There's no nuance. I mean, this is a moving train. Imagine you transport yourself back to a time period of Aaron Bushnell said this. He said, what were you going to do during the enslavement and slavery of African Americans, or during Jim Crow, or during the U.S. Indian Wars? Well, you're doing it today when it comes to the question of Palestine. That's just the reality of it. And they know that the Zionist project has backed itself into a corner. You have generals from their ranks saying that is the state of Israel, the ethno-state of Israel, will not exist if Zionism continues down this path. And now you have places like NYU who are saying that, well, Zionists are a protected class. A state ideology is now a protected class because of the conflation of being a Zionist with being Jewish. And this is something that's like also quite kind of fascinating, because you have somebody who just look at the president of the United States. He says he's a Zionist. He's a Christian Zionist. Does that make him a protected class, an oppressed class now? This is to say nothing of being Palestinian, right? Or having the continual denial of your nationality. Can't fly a flag, can't wear, a keffiyeh. You can't even rent from people without the fear of, getting your children getting stabbed and murdered by them. I mean, we saw this, these are real facts that have happened. Today I'm recording when it was announced that there were 6 hostages killed during an Israeli occupation force raid on one of these tunnels in Gaza. And it's making headlines, and it's like, that's like 6 people, the loss of life is tragic. But what about the 40,000 Palestinians who have been killed? What about the 100,000 plus, 150,000 who are dying as from quote unquote indirect costs of war? And it's like, they're not indirect costs of war. This is an intentional sort of plundering. If you look at even the history of the United States and U.S. settler colonialism, this is out of the U.S. settler colonial playbook. Most Native people in this country were not, in this land, in Turtle Island, were not the victims of a military-led massacre. Many were, but not the majority of people who died. They were killed by plagues. They were killed by communicable diseases. They were killed by famine, hunger, malnutrition, the very things that we're seeing, happen in Gaza. They were killed by the millions over generations, right? Over this long war against Native people. That's what the policy of Zionism is towards Gaza right now. And so when that is your policy, and when you're not speaking out against that as a sort of eliminationist policy, people say, well, it's fascism, and it's like, yeah, maybe there are elements of fascism within the U.S. political system, and for sure within Israeli society. But I would say, why isn't colonialism an equally indicting term as fascism, or if not more? Because colonialism, settler colonialism specifically, should be something that within the 21st century should be something that you can, you ought to be able to recognize and condemn. There should be near universal agreement around condemning settler colonialism, if not colonialism in general. We know it is a a murderous and a very violent system, right? And we know that, yeah, like you can acknowledge it and condemn it in the United States. Like there's all these articles coming out from The Atlantic, which is run by Jeffrey Goldberg, who, himself was a Zionist soldier who was worked at a prison camp. And The Atlantic now kind of puts out this stuff that's like targeting, settler colonial theory and saying, oh, well, it's implying that it's like anti-Semitic to say that like a Jewish ethnostate is a settler colonial state, right? Or that it's European. Well, the Balfour Declaration that happened in Europe, like like it's not just that all of the settlers that came are European settlers, but the European powers came together and, helped create the state of Israel, helped fund, and arm the Zionist militias that expelled, killed, and, to this day are still expelling and killing Palestinians. So there isn't a question that this exists. It's not. It's like to me, it's like baseline to say, oh well, it's settler colonial, right? Because that doesn't propose an alternative. Then you're just doing a land acknowledgement at the DNC. Yeah, it's settler colonial. Oh, we took this land. It's like the man who shows up with your car or like moves into your house and kicks you out and takes all of your things and then says, I acknowledge I did this to you. Well, that's just an acknowledgement. Like, but even the acknowledgement of theft, even like the settlers in Palestine, the Zionist settlers in Palestine call themselves settlers. They think of their project as colonial. They're very clear. Even the liberals, do. There's a mass consensus around the policies of elimination and extermination towards Palestinians. It's not a debate. It's only in the United States where you read the newspapers or you go onto a college campus and the purveyors of violence, the purveyors of genocide claim to be a victim of the people they're genociding, right? And this is classic colonialism. There isn't a whole lot. It's not that deep. And I think when we get into these kind of debates about does it exist or doesn't exist, it's not really, I don't find those really valuable because it's like, well, there's actually an alternative that's being built, and that's the sort of reaction of the Zionist project, is to say, and by the Zionist project, I don't just mean the state of Israel, I also mean, Canada, the United States, and all the settler colonies that prop it up, that arm it, that make sure that give it, political and cultural legitimacy, a place, on the international stage, because they don't want to even approach the alternative. They don't want to even talk about Palestinians as as agents of their own destiny, as people who are, in a resistance movement. You can't even say that in places like Germany. You'll get arrested, right? You'll get arrested. You can get sanctioned in the United States. We're seeing journalists, being pulled out of aircraft, in places like the United Kingdom. We're seeing, journalists and activists and scholars and students get arrested, being surveilled. We don't even know at this moment, what it's like, or what this level of state surveillance is like, right? And it's supposed to have this chilling effect. It's supposed to make you question the things that you're fighting for, to make you feel guilty about having a just cause. So this is the moment, that we find ourselves in. And it's that critical dialectic between foreign and domestic policy, because to maintain this special relationship with the Zionist genocidal project, the United States needs to actually repress its own people and to create authoritarian laws, right? To maintain. So it's like there is this, it's never been more clear. And so that makes this question ever more urgent and ever more, it makes the system kind of like exposes the contradictions and the sort of fallacies within it. Because why put up so much time, energy, labor, and resources to defend this one project? Because it's the soft underbelly of the entire thing, right? And we're seeing the sort of slow declension very slow and violent declension of U.S. imperialism. What defines an imperialist state? Well, typically they have, the control over, production of industries, heavy industries. Well, we saw, the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy. They typically have, the financial sort of power or authority, which we see the dominance of the U.S. dollar, which is being challenged, in many ways. There's a de-dollarization movement. And I guess like the third aspect of that, there's a cultural aspect to that too, but these are sort of the more kind of like realpolitik components of it. The third aspect of that is military power. And military power in the United States, or of the United States, has, so far been one of the kind of more deadly and, I would say, dangerous kind of gambits of this particular moment in time, because they keep saying this, you have these scientists, I don't know anything about the doomsday clock, but they always, we're moving, closer and closer to midnight. The hand for nuclear Armageddon is moving closer and closer to midnight. Because we have, this NATO-led sort of aggression against Russia, and, the buildup of arms, the buildup of forces, the buildup of, espionage, and all these things happening in Europe to sort of wean Europe, or to force it off of like Russian gas, right? And we saw the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, and we saw all these things that are happening, and we see this really bloody war in Ukraine. And now we see this genocide unfold in Palestine. We're also seeing a recapitulation of, European kind of intervention in Haiti, which has been under a sort of UN management, conducted by mostly European countries and settler colonial countries over its political affairs, right? Settler colonialism and imperialism are not concepts of the 19th century. They are 21st century phenomenon. And the sort of demise of these oppressive authoritarian institutions, sadly in this moment, is only going to lead to more authoritarian and oppression and violence, because without, challenge, they're not gonna be knocked off that path, right? This path that we're all careening toward, whether it's climate catastrophe, whether it's nuclear annihilation, or pushing towards a great power conflict. And in this particular moment, they call a lot of people who are on the left, whether you're a socialist, whether you're a communist, they call people on the left like, oh, you're just a dupe, you're a campist, you believe in this politics or that politics, you're cynical, you believe in a European ideology. And my question would be like, so what does that make you when you buy into ruling class political parties? Are you a dupe for imperialism? Are you a dupe for this sort of liberal empire that is, that sits atop a mound of, human bodies and corpses, flesh and blood, and killing, and not even to mention the destruction of non-human life? Like, what does that make you then? And I don't like that politics because it's cynical, and it becomes accusatory, which, in this political moment is fine, but it doesn't build an alternative. And I think if we are going to get out of this cycle, of elections, out of this cycle of destruction, of just voting in for the next commander-in-chief to genocide the next, group of people, or who's going to lead the Palestinian genocide, will it be Netanyahu and Kamala, or will it be Netanyahu and Trump? Like, those aren't real alternatives. So thinking about like deep time and how we build our struggles, and thinking about, generational cycles, and thinking about how, we can't wed ourselves to these eliminationists, these kind of cynical policies and political parties who have led us into this, path of destruction. So I guess the enlightened sort of part of this conversation and where we go from here looks specifically at building alternatives. I've kind of, I've had some like family life changes recently, and it's made me really rethink, my role as, an organizer or somebody who's like doing this podcast, somebody who's out in the world writing books, engaged in these conversations. And I've been focusing a lot of my time and energy when I can locally, and thinking about the Native community that exists in a place like Minneapolis and how we build power. And social media has done a lot of good in terms of, getting us through a pandemic. There's been organizing tools, but it's never going to replace that interaction, that human interface of being in community with people, building power in ways that, create sincere and genuine relations. And I understand that there are still limitations on that kind of, organizing within the sphere of accessibility, and things like that. And also the fact that there are still, deadly communicable diseases, and COVID hasn't really gone away. But nonetheless, we have to start somewhere. And, we shouldn't be restarting our politics every 4 years when there's a new election cycle. We should be thinking about this in long-term solutions, and not, if there's one thing that I ever learned throughout this whole process is, one is you can't vote harder. Yeah, you can vote, that's great, but are you involved in a community organization? Are you involved in real struggle? Do you know your neighbors? Start with a simple campaign, like work on something like, getting, like locally there was the Stop Roof Depot demo. That was something that got me introduced to the Minneapolis community. I met all the sort of like neighbors, people who were involved. There's different sort of political groups, social movements, but I would never have known that. I would never have gotten that sort of exposure had I not been in, physical proximity to people who are in struggle, who know, their neighbors. The other, so you can't vote harder. That's one. And then also when you do vote or you do choose, always choose with your conscience. People are going to say, oh, well, you have to make some political calculation like, well, oh, these third-party candidates, they're never going to win. Well, that's like saying like, well, in the world, well, there's never going to be justice, and there's never going to be, equality. There's never going to be land back. There's never going to be decolonization. So then why don't you just give up? You're actually, it's the choice that you're making is worse than making, no choice at all. And I think that also is not like a cynical politics, and that doesn't provide an alternative. Because if you don't believe in these things, then just get out of the way. Stop. let this next generation who doesn't have access to the same, even like I'm a millennial, but our generation was deprived of many things, like whether it's home ownership, whether it's good jobs, whether it's healthcare, all these things. We saw the taking away of those things, and now we're seeing another generation behind us who has even less, right? And the more you push people into a corner, the more that you strangle their sort of alternatives, whether it's social, economic alternatives, the more resistance you're going to get. That's just the law of nature of human society. You don't need to be a Marxist to understand that. That's just the reality. But at the same time, this idea that you have to vote, you're only given two choices, is one of the most authoritarian and undemocratic assertions that you could actually make. So I'm not asking anybody to vote. I'm not endorsing a candidate. I typically don't talk about, we had Cornel West on. We've had political candidates on in the past to talk about things, but we don't officially endorse people or movement. And I think we don't have candidates, not a lot of candidates, like most candidates don't come from social movements and aren't beholden to them. And I think if we're going to see real change in this country, it's going to have to be this transformation of politics that are guided by social movements, politics that are grounded within the struggles of everyday people. And people will say, well, the question of Palestine, what does that have to do with anything? What does U.S. foreign policy have to do with anything? And if you've been listening to this podcast, you probably have answers to that, but it's not it's not my job to talk to your, your community. That's your job to talk to your community. You should be empowered by the things that we're talking about on here, or you should be empowered by the politics and things that you engage with. Like it might be alienating wherever you're at and where you find yourself, but I grew up, I'll just give you an example. I grew up in Chamberlain, South Dakota, a town of 2,100 people, and I was going to anti-war protests. Chamberlain, not just Chamberlain, the state of South Dakota is like vastly right-wing, right? Not even like some of them, a lot of them are even to the right of Trump. But yet in those struggles, like, yeah, it was alienating. It was scary at times. There were threats of violence, but I found people because I found that there were other people who were thinking like me. But nobody really voiced those opinions until this war came up, and well, what did the war have to do with, us, us like in the middle of South Dakota? And it's like, well, it had everything to do, because it harkens back to the reason why we have reservations, the reason why there's, intergenerational sort of oppression and poverty and historical trauma. Like the investments, like even like the investments into the settler colonial system happen, by white people who literally have no political and economic power in this country. What benefits have been reaped by everyday white poor settlers? Settler colonialism is meant to control white people and these white settlers first and foremost, before it's meant to control us, right? And I think that's an important aspect to think about. It's like, so you have everything to gain from, moving beyond or trying to transcend or overturn these sort of colonial eliminationist logics. And, at the end of the day, it's like, I want to leave, I've been doing a lot of sort of morning reflections. I try to get up in the morning. This is the morning here. I'm in Chicago. I'm thinking about these things in ways that I try to be intentional, to try to, I'm a person of prayer. I pray a lot, but I try to be intentional and think about these things. And this is one of the things that always comes on my mind in the morning. But instead of trying to, open up my social media, going into our, our little rage boxes or our dopamine hits on our smartphones, I try to actually be, grounded within, my own family, within my own community, to think about what am I going to do today that's going to help move the movement. Like, where do I position myself? How can I be a better person and more grounded and present? So I appreciate you all, like, listening thus far on this journey. Sorry if it's rambling. I have a lot more to say, but I want to kind of keep it down to a digestible, content. I really appreciate seeing a lot of our listeners out in the world. I call them, Patreons in the wild, or listeners in the wild. When you come up, I'm starting to carry stickers around with me too. So if you ever see me, I'm a big, tall native guy. If you ever see me, I have a, and you say you're a podcast listener, I'll give you a sticker. I have a sticker. It's always beautiful to see people who support this podcast. This has been an amazing journey for the Red Nation and our crew at Red Media to put this thing together. And it really is, it is really like people powered and people funded. So we really appreciate that. We really try to stick to sort of these ethics and values of, building media, but also building content and movements from below that reflect and articulate. And we hope that, that you look at this election cycle for what it is, and not, prepare yourself. This is something, I also think about a lot and kind of meditate on, is like preparing ourselves for the worst outcomes, but always trying to work for the best, right? Because we can't, some of these outcomes we can't control, we don't have control over. But what we do have control over is our own organizations, our own social movements, and we should be heavily invested in those, and to help see their successes and their rise and their growth. But yeah, it's been a struggle. This last year has been really nightmarish, watching the genocide unfold. I have no words for the amount of grief, rage that I feel, and the sort of admiration that I have for Palestinians who are enduring this, but also, resisting it with every sort of fiber of their being. This existential sort of crisis, this existential threat that they're facing, that is trying to literally wipe them off the map. So we have a lodestar in this moment, and it's Palestine. And so with that, I just want to say, good morning, and thank you for listening.